Hey, what's up, everybody? Today we're looking at Symbiotic Planet, A New Look at Evolution by Lynn Margulis. This is a book that I went into with quite a bit of interest because Lynn Margulis is one of those names that I've seen come up countless times in other books. In fact, I got this book specifically because I wanted to hear for myself what Lynn Margulis has to say, and having done so, I'm not disappointed one bit. Lynn Margulis was one of those figures in science that worked on some more fringe ideas, and she caught quite a bit of criticism for much of it. Most notably, she developed the idea of endosymbiosis, specifically between bacteria and protista, to form what has become what we know today as chloroplasts in plants and mitochondria in animals. And on some of her work, like the example of mitochondria and chloroplasts, it seems she was right. Symbiosis is a fascinating and incredibly important concept in biology that has been popping up a lot in the books that I've been reading lately, and Margulis takes symbiosis to levels that really help to highlight just how important. So that made this book that much more enjoyable for me. This book is part autobiographical as well. Margulis will talk about some of her schooling and work, which I always or usually enjoy in a book like this. It helps to keep the book from being too dry. And I noticed that she writes about this really neat little parallel to the concept of symbiosis in the academic world, which I don't know if she did this on purpose, but she mentioned how back in the 60s, I believe it was, the Department of Genetics and the Department of Paleontology at her university had yet to develop interdepartment research collaboration or data sharing. And today we might think of this as systems approach, the importance of which has been brought into proper appreciation in the last few decades, especially between fields like genetics and paleontology, because these two disciplines are able to address questions that the other may never have had the tools to realize needed to be asked in the first place. And I thought this idea of the different fields working together in new ways was a very nice illustration of how, with symbiosis, something emerges which can be greater than the sum of the parts. A perfect way of thinking about symbiosis. If that was done intentionally, that was a brilliant writing move by Margulis. But Margulis's work wasn't on simply symbiosis, but specific kinds. Symbiogenesis, which was built upon the ideas of an earlier Russian botanist, I think he was, and Margulis's serial endosymbiosis theory, which involves one entity, a bacteria, engulfing another one with complementary attributes, giving rise to a novel, more complex form of life. In this way, we see different capabilities like movement and photosynthesis come together for the first time in a life form. She also goes into fascinating detail on how something like a failed attempt at protists cannibalizing each other resulted in the fusing of genetic material, creating the first diploid organisms, and essentially the creation of sex. And she lays out this whole process of how this happens and how bacteria combining with each other gave rise to the very first protista, the green algal cell, from which sprang the three kingdoms, plantae, fungi, and animalia. We can think about how there are animal-like protists, fungal-like protists, and plant-like protists today. Of course, this book was printed back when we called them protoctista, so this is how they're referred to in this book. But to me, these were some of the most exciting parts to read about in this book. Absolutely fascinating and written at a perfect level of complexity to where a casual science fan like myself can understand it while appreciating the depth of what she's conveying. And speaking on Charles Darwin, Margulis makes an interesting point. She says that with his most famous book being called On the Origin of Species, it actually says very little about the actual origin of species, as in the first species. Well, Darwin's book is talking about the genesis of new species, whereas Margulis is looking into the actual first entities that could be called a species, which she attributes, of course, to endosymbiosis, but she takes it a bit further, saying that most species are the result of endosymbiosis. I'm not sure if she means because it happened so early in our evolutionary history or that endosymbiosis is still taking place today. But this is where it kind of feels like she strays a bit too far away from what we understand about nature. I mean, we have observed the genesis of new species from a parent species, and it happens in predictable, call it Darwinian, evolutionary ways. Either way, this book was a fascinating read, and it actually exceeded my expectations. I don't know why, because Lynn Margulis is a major heavyweight in biology and a name I've heard praised in 100 other science books, but this is the first book by her that I've read. This book closes out with a chapter on Gaia, or the Gaia hypothesis, which I appreciated so much because, like Margulis herself, this is a concept that I've heard discussed many times in other books. But to be honest, this idea of the Gaia hypothesis, created by James Lovelock, was the reason that it took me so long to read Lynn Margulis. The picture most books paint of the Gaia hypothesis is this kind of new age, not really scientific view of Earth. In Symbiotic Planet, Margulis clears up some misconceptions about what the Gaia hypothesis is and is not, and I'm happy to report that it turns out that my understanding of it was simply off. It seems to be just another way of thinking about the complexity of life on Earth. If we look at the levels of organization in biology, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and finally, the biosphere, it turns out that this idea of Gaia is simply another name for the biosphere, which is the largest level of biological organization. This is spelled out clearly in this book by Margulis, and there's no New Age mysticism tied to this view. As Margulis described Gaia, I was thinking, this is the literal definition of the biosphere. So it felt pretty good to read that from an authority on the subject. I'll add that this book was a perfect thing to read if you're a person who has read something like Ed Yong's I Contain Multitudes or Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life. This book kept making me think about those ones, and it made me want to read Yong's book again, which I reviewed it already, but I've learned so much since then that I'd be embarrassed to watch that video. But it's so fascinating to see how symbiosis plays such important roles on so many different levels and scales through the history of the planet. Back in the primordial seas on Earth, there were bacteria coming together, creating more complex life, then protista fusing into even more complex life, then fungal, algal, bacterial lichens breaking apart the early Earth rock, turning it into the first nutrient-rich growing medium for other life, aka soil, in time to usher in the first land plants, who, along with the new land animals, plants, and fungi, co-evolved together, giving rise to the first amniotes, the first insects, the first angiosperms, until now, when the Earth is covered by incredibly complex life forms in a variety of ecosystems and climates. And on Earth, everything is always changing. The planet is almost 5 billion years old, and look how much life has happened. The sun is calculated to burn for another 5 billion years, and who could possibly predict what symbiosis could bring into existence in that kind of time? Okay, that's it for this one, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, I appreciate you sticking with me. I know I haven't done a review in quite a while. I've been pretty busy, but this is definitely a good read. If you've read any of the other books I mentioned in this video, if you're just interested in biology or early life or the subject of symbiosis, or if you just want a better understanding of what the Gaia hypothesis is, definitely check out Symbiotic Planet by Lynn Margulis.